Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Bruce Sanders had built his life like he built his construction projects, with precision, dedication, and an unwavering belief that hard work would be rewarded. At 42, he owned Sanders Construction, a mid-sized company that had earned a reputation for completing projects on time and under budget. His calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of a man who'd started swinging hammers at 16 and never stopped building. The house on Maple Street had been his masterpiece, a custom home he designed and built for his wife Claudia Holden and their 8-year-old daughter Emma. Every beam, every tile, every carefully crafted detail had been a love letter to his family. The wraparound porch where Emma played with her dolls, the kitchen island where Claudia used to laugh while cooking Sunday dinners, the master bedroom with a vaulted ceiling he'd framed himself. All of it now felt like a mausoleum. "Daddy, why can't I live with you?" Emma had asked 3 months ago, her small hand gripping his as they sat on the courthouse steps after the custody hearing. Her blonde hair, so much like her mother's, caught the afternoon sunlight as tears streamed down her cheeks. Bruce had knelt to her level, his throat tight. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense, sweetheart. But no matter what happens, you're always going to be my little girl." What he hadn't told her was that Claudia's lawyer, Dean Snyder, had painted Bruce as an absent father too consumed with work to properly care for a child. The accusations had been carefully crafted. Never home for dinner, missing school plays, prioritizing construction sites over family time. None of it was entirely false, which made it devastatingly effective. Now, sitting in his empty apartment above the construction company office, Bruce stared at the custody modification papers that had arrived that morning. Claudia was requesting sole custody and a complete termination of his parental rights. The grounds? Emma had formed a strong paternal bond with her mother's boyfriend, Theodore Lane, and the child psychologist recommended maintaining stability by allowing the new father figure to legally adopt her. Theodore Lane. The name made Bruce's jaw clench. He'd met the man once, briefly, when picking up Emma for one of his increasingly rare weekend visits. Tall, clean-shaven, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd smiled with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, extending a manicured hand that had never known a day of real work. "You must be the ex-husband," Theodore had said, his tone carrying just enough condescension to set Bruce's teeth on edge. "Emma's told me so much about you." Bruce's phone buzzed, pulling him from the memory. A text from his foreman. "Miller Project's behind schedule. Need you on site tomorrow." He set the phone aside without responding. For the first time in his life, work didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the growing certainty that he was losing his daughter to a man who'd never scraped his knuckles on concrete or stayed up all night with a sick child. The apartment felt suffocating. Bruce grabbed his jacket and headed for Murphy's Tavern, the blue-collar bar where his crew often gathered after long days. The familiar smell of beer and fried food usually provided comfort, but tonight it felt hollow. "Rough day?" asked Murphy, the Irish bartender who'd been serving Bruce's father drinks in this same spot 30 years ago. "My ex-wife wants to erase me," Bruce said, accepting the whiskey Murphy poured without being asked. "Replace me with some corporate type who thinks he can buy his way into being a father." Murphy nodded sympathetically. He'd seen plenty of good men broken by bad divorces. "What's your lawyer saying?" "Same thing they all say. Fight it in court. Hope for the best. Write another check." Bruce downed the whiskey in one bitter swallow. "Problem is, her lawyer's Dean Snyder. Man's got a reputation for destroying fathers in custody cases." "Snyder?" Murphy's expression darkened. "That bastard went after my cousin Jimmy 2 years ago. Left him with nothing. No kids, no house, no dignity. Jimmy never recovered from it." Bruce had heard similar stories. Dean Snyder was known throughout the county as the lawyer you hired when you wanted to inflict maximum damage. He specialized in high-conflict divorces, particularly those involving successful businessmen. His strategy was always the same. Paint the father as either absent, abusive, or incompetent, then watch as the court system did the rest. "There's got to be something you can do," Murphy said, refilling the glass. A man's got rights. Not according to Snyder. Man acts like he's on some kind of crusade against fathers. Bruce stared into the amber liquid. And now my daughter thinks Theodore Lane hung the moon. 8 years old, and she's already calling him dad. The words tasted like poison. Bruce had been there for Emma's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. He'd taught her to ride a bike, bandaged her scraped knees, and read her bedtime stories every night until Claudia decided she wanted something different. Now a stranger was collecting all the rewards of his sacrifice. As Bruce sat there, drowning his rage in Irish whiskey, he had no idea that his ex-wife's boyfriend was, at that very moment, making plans that would change everything. Theodore Lane wasn't just some corporate climber looking for a ready-made family. He was something far more dangerous, and Bruce Sanders was about to discover exactly what happens when a man with nothing left to lose faces an enemy who's already taken everything. The foundation Bruce had built his life on was cracking, but he hadn't fallen yet. And when Bruce Sanders finally fell, he intended to take everyone responsible down with him. Chapter 2. The players reveal themselves. The law offices of Snyder and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of downtown's most prestigious building. Dean Snyder had chosen the location deliberately. Height meant power in his world, and he wanted every client and opponent to understand exactly where they stood in relation to him. At 51, Snyder had built his reputation on the wreckage of broken families, specializing in what he called strategic dissolution, finding the precise legal pressure points that would maximize his client's advantage while minimizing their opponent's resources to fight back. His corner office overlooked the courthouse where he'd won hundreds of cases, each victory adding another layer to his carefully constructed legend. The walls displayed his law degree from Columbia, framed newspaper clippings detailing high-profile victories, and a collection of awards from various bar associations. What they didn't show were the families he'd destroyed, the children he'd separated from loving parents, or the suicides that had followed some of his more brutal campaigns. "Claudia, darling, you look radiant," Snyder said as his secretary ushered in his star client. Claudia Holden had transformed herself since filing for divorce. Gone was the suburban mother in jeans and sweaters, replaced by a perfectly coiffed woman in designer clothes that accentuated her figure. The transformation hadn't been accidental. Snyder always coached his female clients on presentation. Juries and judges responded better to women who looked like victims rather than aggressors. "Dean, I got your message about the custody modification." Claudia settled into the leather chair across from his desk, her manicured nails drumming nervously against her Hermes bag. "Is it really necessary?" Bruce already barely sees Emma. "Necessary?" Snyder's smile was predatory. "Claudia, we're not just talking about custody. We're talking about completely severing Bruce's parental rights so Theodore can adopt Emma legally. Think of it as insurance. No more alimony, no more child support obligations, no more dealing with an ex-husband who might decide to cause problems down the road." The truth was more complicated. Theodore Lane had been pressuring Claudia to pursue complete termination, but his motivations weren't entirely paternal. Lane had his own reasons for wanting Bruce Sanders out of the picture permanently, reasons that had nothing to do with Emma's best interests. "What if Bruce fights it?" Claudia asked. "He loves Emma." He might. He might what? Hire a lawyer better than me." Snyder's laugh was cold. "Claudia, your ex-husband is a construction worker. A successful one, I'll grant you, but still a man who works with his hands for a living. He doesn't understand how the system really works. By the time I'm finished with him, he'll be lucky to have supervised visitation twice a month." Across town, Theodore Lane was having his own meeting in an environment that couldn't have been more different from Snyder's polished office. The warehouse district had been slowly gentrifying, but pockets of the old industrial area remained untouched by developers. In one of these forgotten buildings, Lane sat across from a man whose real name he'd never learned and never wanted to know. "The situation's becoming complicated," Lane said, his usual corporate composure slightly strained. "There's a custody hearing next week, and the father might cause problems." The man across from him was built like a refrigerator, broad shoulders, thick neck, hands that looked capable of significant violence. His name was Herbert Lucas, though everyone called him Herb. He ran what law enforcement euphemistically called a waste disposal business, but his actual services extended far beyond garbage collection. Problems how? Herb's voice carried the gravelly tone of a lifetime smoker. Bruce Sanders, that's the father. He's not the type to give up easily. He built his business from nothing, and guys like that don't know when to quit. If he starts digging into my background, asking questions, Lane left the sentence hanging. What Theodore Lane hadn't told Claudia, or Snyder, or anyone else, was that his corporate success story was built on a foundation of carefully managed fraud. His investment firm, Lane Capital, had been running an elaborate shell game for 3 years, moving client money between fake accounts to cover losses from increasingly desperate gambles in high-risk markets. The scheme was sophisticated enough to fool regulators for now, but a determined investigation would expose everything. How much trouble are we talking about? Herb asked. Enough to destroy everything I've built, and everyone connected to me. Lane's meaning was clear. If he went down, others would follow. Herb nodded slowly. He'd worked with men like Lane before, successful criminals who lived in terror of exposure. What do you want me to do about it? Nothing dramatic. Just make sure he understands that some fights aren't worth having. Maybe his construction business runs into some unexpected problems. Equipment failures, permit issues, that sort of thing. Enough pressure to make him focus on survival instead of custody battles. It was a reasonable plan, the kind of psychological warfare that Herb specialized in. Apply pressure gradually, let the target's imagination do most of the work, and most people would fold before things escalated to actual violence. Unfortunately for Theodore Lane, he'd fundamentally misunderstood the kind of man he was dealing with. Bruce Sanders hadn't built his construction company by backing down from fights. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where showing weakness was an invitation to victimization, and he'd learned early that sometimes the only way to stop a bully was to hit back harder than they expected. More importantly, he'd spent 25 years in an industry where knowing the right people could mean the difference between success and failure. That evening, as Bruce sat in Murphy's Tavern nursing his second whiskey, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in 15 years. Sam Erickson. Jesus Christ, is this really Bruce Sanders? The voice on the other end was rougher than Bruce remembered, but unmistakably Sam. Depends who's asking, Bruce replied, though he was already smiling. Sam Erickson had been his closest friend growing up, the kind of bond forged in childhood that survived decades of separation. It's your old partner in crime, asshole. I heard through the grapevine that you were having some family trouble. Bruce's smile faded. News travels fast. Fast enough. Listen, I'm in town for a few days. Why don't we grab dinner tomorrow? Catch up on old times. What Bruce didn't know was that Sam Erickson's job with the State Department had taken him to some very dark places over the past 15 years. He'd learned skills that weren't taught in any official training manual, made contacts that existed in the shadowy spaces between legitimate government work and plausible deniability. And he'd never forgotten the loyalty of the boy who'd stood by him when everyone else had written him off as a lost cause. The war for Emma's future was about to become something much more dangerous than a simple custody battle. Theodore Lane had made the mistake of bringing outside pressure to bear on a man who had his own resources, and Dean Snyder was about to discover that not every father could be broken by the court system alone. Sometimes, when the law failed to provide justice, men found other ways to protect what mattered most to them. And Bruce Sanders was rapidly running out of legal options. Chapter 3. The web begins to tighten. The custody hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, but by Tuesday evening, Bruce Sanders felt like he was drowning in quicksand. His lawyer, a well-meaning but overmatched public defender named Alan Forbes, had called with the latest devastating news. Bruce, I'm going to be straight with you. Snyder's filed 3 additional motions, and frankly, I don't know how to counter them. He's claiming you've been making threatening statements about your ex-wife's boyfriend, that you've been drinking heavily, and that your business is facing financial difficulties that make you an unstable influence on Emma. Bruce gripped the phone tighter. None of that's true. I know that, and you know that, but Snyder's got affidavits. A bartender who says you were talking about making Theodore Lane pay. Bank records showing irregular deposits and withdrawals from your business accounts. Photos of you leaving Murphy's Tavern looking intoxicated. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Bruce had been under surveillance, his words twisted, his financial records manipulated to create a narrative of instability. Dean Snyder wasn't just a lawyer. He was a strategic assassin who understood that custody battles were won outside the courtroom long before they reached a judge. How was this legal? Bruce asked. It's not about legal, Bruce. It's about effective. Snyder's building a case that you're a potentially dangerous influence on Emma, and I don't have the resources to fight this kind of campaign. He's probably got investigators following you, people watching your business, maybe even someone inside your organization feeding him information. After hanging up, Bruce sat in his empty apartment, staring at the walls he'd built with his own hands. Everything he'd worked for was being systematically destroyed by people who treated his life like a game. But as the rage threatened to consume him, Bruce remembered something his father had told him years ago. Son, when someone's got you in a corner, you don't fight fair. You fight to win. His phone buzzed with a text from Sam Erickson. Dinner tomorrow at Romano's. 7 p.m. Come alone. Romano's was a small Italian restaurant in the Warehouse District, the kind of place where conversations could be held without interruption. Bruce arrived early, choosing a corner booth that gave him a clear view of the entrance. When Sam walked in, Bruce barely recognized him. Gone was the scrawny kid from the old neighborhood. Sam Erickson had filled out into a compact, dangerous-looking man whose eyes constantly scanned the room as he moved. His handshake was firm but brief, and when he sat down, he positioned himself so he could watch both the entrance and the kitchen. You look like hell, Sam said without preamble. Feel worse. Bruce signaled the waitress for 2 beers. Guess you heard about the divorce. I heard about more than the divorce. I heard you're dealing with Dean Snyder and that your ex-wife's boyfriend is Theodore Lane. Sam's expression was carefully neutral. That's interesting company she's keeping. You know Lane? Know of him. His name's come up in some circles where people like me pay attention to things like money laundering and offshore accounts. Sam accepted his beer, but didn't drink. Let me ask you something, Bruce. How well do you really know your ex-wife? The question caught Bruce off guard. What do you mean? Did she just wake up one morning and decide she wanted a divorce? Or was there something that triggered it? Some event? Some person who maybe encouraged her to make a change? Bruce thought back to the months before Claudia had filed. She'd started working out obsessively, buying new clothes, going out with girlfriends he'd never met. At the time, he'd assumed it was a midlife crisis, a natural response to the stress of marriage and motherhood. Now, with Sam's question hanging in the air, he began to see a different pattern. You think she was planning this for a while? I think your ex-wife met Theodore Lane before she filed for divorce. And I think Lane had reasons for wanting to get close to your family that had nothing to do with love. Sam finally took a sip of his beer. The question is, what are you willing to do about it? What do you mean? Are you going to let them destroy you through the court system, or are you going to fight back? Sam's voice dropped lower. Because if you want to fight back, really fight back, I might be able to help. But once we go down that road, there's no turning around. Bruce stared at his oldest friend, understanding that this was a crossroads moment. He could accept defeat gracefully, walk away from Emma, and start over somewhere else. Or he could trust Sam and whatever dark knowledge he'd gained in his years with the State Department. What kind of help are we talking about? Sam smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The kind that evens the playing field. See, Bruce, your problem isn't that you're outgunned. It's that you're fighting by rules the other side has already thrown out the window. Dean Snyder's got investigators. Theodore Lane's got money and connections. And they're both willing to break laws to get what they want. The only way to beat people like that is to be better at their own game than they are. I'm a construction worker, Sam. I build things. I don't know how to play these kinds of games. No, but I do. And lucky for you, I owe you enough favors to make this interesting. Sam leaned forward. Here's what I know. Theodore Lane is dirty, Claudia isn't over her head, and Dean Snyder's made a lot of enemies over the years. Give me 3 days, and I'll give you enough ammunition to turn this whole thing around. And if you can't, then we move to Plan B, which is... Sam's smile grew wider and considerably more dangerous. Let's just say that some problems require more direct solutions. Bruce felt something shift inside him, a fundamental change in perspective that he recognized but couldn't quite name. For months, he'd been reacting to other people's moves, trying to defend himself against attacks he couldn't predict or counter. Now, for the first time since this nightmare began, he was being offered the chance to take the initiative. What do you need from me? Access, names, financial records, everything you can remember about how this all started. Sam pulled out a notebook. And Bruce, from now on, you don't talk to anyone about anything without checking with me first. No phone calls, no texts, no conversations that aren't absolutely necessary. These people have been playing chess while you've been playing checkers, but that's about to change. As Bruce walked back to his apartment that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. It was dangerous hope, the kind that came with accepting that sometimes good people had to do questionable things to protect what mattered most. But it was hope nonetheless. Theodore Lane and Dean Snyder thought they were hunting a wounded animal. They were about to discover they'd cornered a predator instead. And in 3 days, the real war would begin. Chapter 4. The investigation deepens. Sam Erickson hadn't been entirely truthful about his current employment status. While he had worked for the State Department, his resignation 2 years earlier had been less than voluntary. Officially, he'd left to pursue private consulting opportunities. Unofficially, he'd been forced out after a mission in Eastern Europe had gone sideways, leaving him with skills the government no longer wanted him to use and contacts they preferred to forget existed. Now he made his living in the gray areas between legal and illegal, helping people who couldn't find justice through traditional channels. His clients ranged from wealthy executives dealing with corporate espionage to desperate parents whose children had been kidnapped by ex-spouses who'd fled the country. The work paid well, but more importantly, it let him use his particular talents for people who actually deserved help. Bruce Sanders definitely deserved help. Within 12 hours of their dinner, Sam had compiled a preliminary dossier on Theodore Lane that made for fascinating reading. Lane Capital Management had been incorporated 3 years earlier, right around the time Lane had started showing up at social events in the wealthy suburb where Claudia lived. The firm claimed to manage investments for high-net-worth individuals, but several details didn't add up. For starters, Lane's office was far too expensive for a legitimate startup investment firm. The building's lease alone cost more per month than most financial advisors made in a year. His client list was suspiciously thin for someone who could afford such overhead, and the few names Sam could verify through public records didn't seem to have the kind of wealth that would justify Lane's lifestyle. More interesting was Lane's background. His resume claimed an MBA from Wharton and previous experience with Goldman Sachs. But when Sam ran the details through a contact who still worked in government databases, the story started falling apart. Theodore Lane had attended Wharton, but he'd been quietly dismissed in his second year for academic dishonesty. The Goldman Sachs employment was real but brief. He lasted 8 months before being terminated for what the official records euphemistically called policy violations. "This guy's a fraud," Sam told Bruce when they met the next morning at a diner outside town. "Question is, what kind of fraud, and how deep does it go?" Bruce stared at the photos Sam had taken of Lane's office building. "Does this help with the custody case?" "Maybe. Depends on how dirty he actually is." Sam spread out additional documents. "But I found something else that's more immediately useful. Your ex-wife's lawyer has some interesting financial arrangements. Dean Snyder's bank records have been significantly harder to access, requiring Sam to leverage contacts he'd hoped never to use again. But the effort had been worthwhile. Snyder's firm was receiving monthly payments from something called Clearwater Holdings, a shell company that traced back through several intermediaries to Lane Capital Management. Lane's paying Snyder directly, Bruce said, understanding the implications immediately. That's got to be illegal. Unethical, definitely. Illegal, probably. But proving it in court would take months, and you don't have months. Sam lit a cigarette, ignoring the no-smoking sign. "However, this gives us leverage. Snyder's reputation is everything to him. If word got out that he was taking money from opposing parties, you're talking about blackmail. I'm talking about negotiations. There's a difference." Sam's smile was cold. "See, right now Snyder thinks he's dealing with some blue-collar guy who doesn't understand how the game is played. He's about to learn differently. But even as they planned their next move, Theodore Lane was implementing plans of his own. The pressure campaign against Bruce's business had begun subtly. A few surprise visits from building inspectors who found violations that hadn't existed the week before, permit delays for projects that had been pre-approved, and mysterious equipment failures that cost thousands of dollars to repair. Bruce's foreman, Sean Farrell, had been dealing with the construction business for 30 years and recognized the pattern immediately. "Boss, this isn't coincidence," he said when Bruce visited the Miller Project site. "Somebody's got it in for us, and they've got connections." The latest problem was potentially catastrophic. The city had suddenly decided that the foundation work on their biggest current project didn't meet updated seismic standards, despite the fact that the plans had been approved 6 months earlier. Bringing the work up to the new standards would cost nearly $200,000, money that Sanders Construction didn't have. Who complained about the foundation? Bruce asked. Anonymous tip, according to the inspector. But the guy who called it in knew exactly what to look for. Wasn't some random concerned citizen. Sean spat into the dirt. "Whoever's doing this knows our business better than they should." That evening, as Bruce sat in his apartment trying to figure out how to save his company, Sam called with an update that changed everything. "I know who's feeding information to Lane," Sam said without preamble. "Your bookkeeper, Stacy Flynn. She's been photographing financial documents and sending them to someone at Snyder's office." Bruce felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Stacy had worked for Sanders Construction for 8 years. She'd started as a receptionist fresh out of high school and had worked her way up to handling all the company's financial records. Bruce had trusted her completely, even giving her access to his personal accounts to handle bill payments when he was on job sites. "How do you know?" "Because I've been watching her for 2 days. She stayed late last night and spent an hour photographing files with her phone. Then she drove to a parking garage downtown where she met with a man who matches the description of one of Snyder's investigators." Sam's voice was grim. "Bruce, she's been doing this for months. They know everything about your business, your finances, your daily routine. That's how they've been staying one step ahead." The betrayal cut deeper than the divorce. Claudia had at least been honest about wanting out of their marriage. But Stacy Flynn had smiled at him every morning while systematically destroying everything he'd built. "What do we do about it?" "We turn her into an asset," Sam said. "But first, we need to have a conversation with Dean Snyder. Face to face. He won't see me. His office told my lawyer that all communication has to go through official channels. He'll see us." Sam's tone carried absolute certainty. "Because we're going to offer him something he wants more than Theodore Lane's money." "Which is?" "His reputation. Intact." Sam paused. "Meet me tomorrow at his office building. Noon. And Bruce, wear a suit. We won't look like people who matter." As Bruce hung up the phone, he realized that the scared, desperate man who'd been losing everything was gone. In his place was someone harder, someone willing to fight fire with fire. Theodore Lane and Dean Snyder thought they were hunting a wounded deer. They were about to discover they'd cornered a wolf instead. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. Dean Snyder's secretary, a severe woman in her 50s named Marguerite Kahn, looked up from her computer with the kind of disdain typically reserved for door-to-door salesmen. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Snyder doesn't take unscheduled appointments. If you'd like to make an appointment, tell him that Bruce Sanders and Sam Erickson are here to discuss Clearwater Holdings," Sam said quietly. His voice carried no threat, but something in his tone made Marguerite's fingers pause over her keyboard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sam smiled and placed a manila envelope on her desk. "Tell him we have photographs and bank records, and that we're happy to wait." The color drained from Marguerite's face as she looked at the envelope. Without another word, she picked up her phone and pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Snyder? There are 2 gentlemen here who say it's urgent." Within minutes, Dean Snyder appeared in the reception area, his usual confident demeanor noticeably strained. He was shorter than Bruce had expected, a man who used expensive clothes and aggressive posture to project authority he didn't naturally possess. His eyes fixed on the envelope in Sam's hands like a snake watching a mongoose. "Gentlemen, I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. I can't discuss ongoing legal matters without." "We're not here to discuss legal matters," Sam interrupted. "We're here to discuss business arrangements that might interest the State Bar Association." Snyder's jaw tightened. "My office." Now, the elevator ride to the 20th floor was conducted in absolute silence. Snyder's corner office was everything Bruce had expected. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, law books that looked like they'd never been opened, and windows that overlooked the courthouse where he destroyed so many lives. What Bruce hadn't expected was the visible fear in Snyder's eyes as he closed the door behind them. "What do you want?" Snyder asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Sam opened the envelope and spread out a series of photographs and bank statements. "We want you to explain these. Monthly payments from Clearwater Holdings to your firm's operating account. Clearwater Holdings, which is owned by Lane Capital Management, which is owned by your client's boyfriend." Sam looked up with mock confusion. "Help me understand how this isn't a conflict of interest." Snyder barely glanced at the documents. "Those payments are for consulting services. Perfectly legitimate." "Consulting on what?" Bruce asked. "How to destroy the father of your client's child." "I don't have to explain my business practices to you." Sam laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Actually, you do. See, Mr. Snyder, we've been watching you for several days now. We know about the investigators you've hired to follow Bruce. We know about the bribes you've paid to building inspectors. We know about Stacy Flynn and the financial information she's been stealing from Sanders Construction. You can't prove any of that. We don't have to prove it. We just have to make enough noise that people start asking questions." Sam leaned forward. "How do you think the State Bar would react to these bank records? How about your other clients? What happens to your reputation when word gets out that Dean Snyder takes money from both sides in divorce cases?" For the first time since they'd entered the office, Snyder looked genuinely worried. His entire career was built on his reputation as an ethical lawyer who fought for his clients' interests. If that reputation crumbled, everything else would follow. "What do you want?" he asked again, but this time the question carried the weight of defeat. "We want you to withdraw the custody modification petition," Bruce said. "We want you to fire the investigators. And we want you to end your business relationship with Theodore Lane." "I can't do that. Claudia is my client." "Then explain to Claudia that her boyfriend has been paying her lawyer under the table," Sam suggested. "I'm sure she'll understand that this creates certain complications." Snyder was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through options and finding them all unpalatable. Finally, he looked up at Bruce with something that might have been respect. "You're not what I expected." "I'm exactly what you should have expected," Bruce replied. "I'm a father fighting for his daughter. Did you really think I was going to roll over and let you destroy my family? This isn't over. Theodore Lane won't just walk away." Sam's smile returned, sharp and predatory. "That's fine. We haven't finished our investigation into Mr. Lane yet, but we've learned some very interesting things about his business practices, things that might interest the SEC. You're playing a dangerous game." "No," Bruce said, standing up. "We're playing the same game you've been playing all along. The difference is we're better at it than you are." As they left Snyder's office, Bruce felt a satisfaction he hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since this nightmare began, he'd seen fear in his enemy's eyes. But he also understood that this was just the beginning. They'd won a battle, but Theodore Lane was still out there, still dangerous, and still threatened by Bruce's very existence. How long before Lane figures out what happened? Bruce asked as they waited for the elevator. "He already knows. Snyder probably called him before we made it to the parking garage." Sam pressed the button for the ground floor. "Which is good. We want him worried. Worried people make mistakes. And if he doesn't make mistakes?" Sam's reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors looked like a stranger. Hard, cold, completely without mercy. "Then we help him along." As they drove away from Snyder's office building, neither man noticed the black sedan that pulled into traffic 3 cars behind them. Theodore Lane had indeed made the phone call Sam predicted, but he'd also made another call to Herbert Lucas. The pressure campaign against Bruce Sanders was about to escalate dramatically. But then again, so was Bruce's campaign against Theodore Lane. Chapter 6: The Trap Springs. Theodore Lane's hands shook slightly as he poured his 3rd scotch of the afternoon. His penthouse office overlooked the city's financial district, But the view that usually calmed him now felt like a reminder of how far he had to fall. The phone call from Dean Snyder had been devastating, not just because Sanders had somehow uncovered their financial arrangement, but because of what it implied about the man's capabilities. Lane had built his entire criminal enterprise on the assumption that he was smarter than everyone around him. His clients trusted him because he looked successful, his business partners feared him because he seemed connected, and his enemies underestimated him because he appeared to be just another corrupt financial advisor. But Bruce Sanders wasn't underestimating him anymore, and that changed everything. "You told me he was a simple construction worker," Lane said into his phone. Herbert Lucas's gravelly voice came through the speaker with its usual lack of emotion. "He is a construction worker, but he's got help. Professional help." "What kind of professional help?" "The kind that knows how to conduct surveillance without being detected. The kind that can access financial records that should be confidential. The kind that might have friends in law enforcement." Herb paused. "This changes the price." "How much?" "Double. And we do this my way, not yours." Lane closed his eyes. Doubling Herb's fee would cost him nearly $50,000, money he didn't actually have. But walking away wasn't an option anymore. If Sanders kept digging, he'd eventually discover that Lane Capital Management was little more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme. And when that happened, Lane wouldn't just lose his freedom. He'd lose everything, including Claudia and Emma. "Fine, but I want this finished quickly." "It'll be finished when it's finished. Don't call me again unless the building's on fire." Across town, Bruce was experiencing his own moment of revelation, though his was considerably more positive. Stacy Flynn sat across from him in the conference room at Sanders Construction, her face red with shame and her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sam had been right about her willingness to cooperate once confronted with evidence of her betrayal. "They told me you were hiding money from Claudia," she said, not meeting Bruce's eyes. "They said you were trying to cheat her out of what she deserved, and that I was helping make sure Emma would be taken care of. And you believe them?" "I wanted to believe them." The man from Snyder's office, he was very convincing. "He showed me legal documents that made it look like you were planning to hide assets offshore." Stacy finally looked up. "I'm sorry, Bruce. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." Bruce studied the woman who'd been handling his finances for 8 years. She was young, barely 26, and came from the kind of background where an offer of $5,000 for what seemed like whistleblowing would be impossible to refuse. In other circumstances, he might have felt sorry for her. "Here's what's going to happen," he said finally. "You're going to keep working for Snyder's investigator. You're going to give him exactly what he expects to receive. But from now on, you're going to clear everything through Sam before you send it. You want me to be a double agent? I want you to help me save my relationship with my daughter," Bruce said. "And maybe help yourself avoid charges for corporate espionage and theft." Sam had been watching the conversation from the corner of the room, and now he stepped forward with a manila folder. "Stacy, we need you to understand something. Theodore Lane isn't who he claims to be, and the people you've been working for aren't the good guys in this story." He opened the folder and spread out documents that told the real story of Lane Capital Management. Bank records showed money flowing in from clients, but never flowing back out. Investment statements claimed profits on trades that had never been executed. Most damning of all were email records that Sam had obtained through methods he declined to explain, showing Lane discussing how to keep investors from asking too many questions about their returns. "He's stealing from his clients," Stacy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's been stealing from his clients for 3 years," Sam confirmed. "And when this all comes out, and it will come out, everyone who helped him is going to be considered an accomplice. That includes Dean Snyder. It includes you. Unless you help us stop him," Bruce added. "In which case, you might end up being considered a witness instead of a criminal." Stacy looked between the two men, understanding that her comfortable life of taking money from both sides was over. The only question now was whether she'd end up in prison or in witness protection. "What do you want me to do?" Over the next hour, Sam explained exactly what information they needed and how Stacy should continue feeding carefully crafted misinformation to Snyder's investigator. The goal was to make Lane believe that Bruce was more vulnerable than he actually was, while simultaneously gathering evidence of Lane's financial crimes. "There's one more thing," Sam said as they prepared to leave. "Tonight, you're going to receive a call from someone claiming to be from the FBI. They're going to ask you to meet them tomorrow morning at a coffee shop downtown. You're going to agree to that meeting." "The FBI?" Stacy's voice cracked. "I thought you said I wouldn't be in trouble if I cooperated." "You won't be, because the person calling you won't actually be from the FBI." Sam's smile was reassuring and terrifying in equal measure. "Trust me, Stacy. By tomorrow afternoon, this whole thing will be over." As they drove away from the construction company, Bruce felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that he recognized from his contracting days. It was the feeling he got just before attempting something that would either work perfectly or fail catastrophically. "You want to tell me what's really happening tomorrow?" he asked. "Tomorrow, Theodore Lane is going to learn that sometimes the best way to catch a rat is to make him think he's one." Sam turned onto the highway leading back toward the city. "And then he's going to make a phone call that changes everything." That evening, as Bruce sat in his apartment trying to distract himself with television, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's number, and for a moment his heart stopped. She almost never called anymore, and when she did, it was usually because Claudia was forcing her to. "Hi, Daddy." "Hey, sweetheart. How are you?" "I'm okay. I wanted to tell you something." Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "Theodore says you might be going away for a while. He says you did something bad and that I shouldn't worry about it because he's going to take care of me now." Bruce closed his eyes, feeling rage build in his chest like pressure in a boiler. "Emma, Daddy's not going anywhere, and I didn't do anything bad. Sometimes adults have disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements get complicated. But Theodore says, Theodore doesn't know me, baby girl. He doesn't know what kind of man I am or what I'm capable of." Bruce's voice was gentle but firm. "And in a few days, you're going to understand that Daddy always keeps his promises." After Emma hung up, Bruce sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, thinking about the conversation Sam had described. Tomorrow, Theodore Lane would receive information that would terrify him enough to make a crucial mistake. And when he made that mistake, Bruce Sanders would finally have his revenge. But revenge, Bruce was beginning to understand, was a dish best served with a side of justice. And justice was what Theodore Lane was about to receive. Chapter 7. The Phone Call. The coffee shop on 5th Street was exactly the kind of anonymous location where nervous informants might meet federal agents. Stacy Flynn arrived precisely on time, her hands shaking as she ordered a latte and found a corner table. The man who approached her 5 minutes later looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of an FBI agent. Dark suit, conservative tie, and the kind of serious expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Flynn?" "Agent Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division." He showed her a badge that looked completely authentic because it was completely authentic. Sam Erickson had called in one final favor from his government contacts, and Agent Jose Martinez was conducting a legitimate investigation into several financial firms suspected of running Ponzi schemes. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Martinez said, settling into the chair across from her. "I understand you work for Sanders Construction and that you've been in contact with Theodore Lane's investment firm." "Ah, yes, but I was just doing what Mr. Snyder's office asked me to do." "Mr. Snyder's office asked you to provide financial information to Theodore Lane?" Stacy nodded miserably. "They said it was for the custody case, to make sure Mr. Sanders wasn't hiding assets from his ex-wife." Martinez made notes in a small notebook, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Ms. Flynn, I need you to understand something. Theodore Lane is under federal investigation for securities fraud. Lane Capital Management has been operating as an unlicensed investment advisor, taking money from clients and using it for unauthorized purposes." "You mean he's stealing?" "I mean he's facing federal charges that could result in 20 years in prison. And anyone who helped him access the financial information he used to target victims could be considered an accessory." Martinez let that sink in before continuing. "However, the Bureau is always interested in witnesses who can help us understand how these schemes operate." By the time their conversation ended, Stacy Flynn understood exactly what she needed to do. She would continue feeding information to Snyder's investigator, but now she would also be documenting everything for the FBI. More importantly, she would be wearing a wire for her next meeting with Lane's contact. Agent Martinez had been very clear about the timeline. They needed actionable evidence within 48 hours, or the window for making arrests would close. Theodore Lane was already showing signs of preparing to flee the jurisdiction, and once he disappeared, recovering his client's money would become nearly impossible. What Stacy didn't know was that Agent Martinez had a secondary agenda. The financial crimes investigation was real, but his cooperation with Sam Erickson was motivated by more than professional courtesy. Martinez had his own reasons for wanting to see Theodore Lane in handcuffs, reasons that dated back to a case in Miami, where Lane had escaped prosecution on a technicality, leaving behind dozens of ruined investors and a paper trail that had consumed 2 years of Martinez's life. Meanwhile, Theodore Lane was having lunch at the country club where he'd first met Claudia, trying to project normalcy while his world collapsed around him. Dean Snyder's phone call that morning had been devastating. The custody modification petition was being withdrawn. The pressure campaign against Sanders Construction had to end immediately, and their financial arrangement was terminated effective immediately. "I don't understand," Lane had protested. "We had an agreement. Our agreement didn't include federal investigators asking questions about offshore accounts," Snyder had replied coldly. "You didn't tell me that your business practices might attract attention from law enforcement." Now Lane sat at his usual table, surrounded by the wealthy suburban elite who had provided most of his victims, trying to figure out how much time he had before everything collapsed. His phone buzzed with a text from Herbert Lucas. "We need to meet." Now, the meeting took place in the same warehouse where they'd first discussed applying pressure to Bruce Sanders. But this time, Herb's demeanor was completely different. Gone was the professional courtesy of a service provider. In its place was the cold calculation of a predator who sensed weakness. "Your construction worker problem just became our problem," Herb said without preamble. "My sources tell me that federal agents are asking questions about financial firms in this area. Specifically, financial firms that might be running Ponzi schemes." Lane felt his blood turn to ice water. How is that possible? Because Bruce Sanders isn't just some blue-collar guy with a toolbox. He's got connections, and those connections know how to make things happen. Herb lit a cigarette and studied Lane with the dispassionate interest of a biologist examining a specimen. "The question is, what are you going to do about it? What can I do? If the FBI is involved, the FBI is involved because Sanders made them involved. Remove Sanders, and the heat goes away. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about problem solving. Your choice is simple. Deal with Bruce Sanders permanently, or spend the next 20 years in federal prison." Herb dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "But decide fast, because if you don't make this problem go away, I will. And my solution might include removing everyone who can connect me to this situation." The threat was unmistakable. Theodore Lane had become a liability, and Herbert Lucas was offering him one last chance to prove his value. After Herb left, Lane sat alone in the warehouse, understanding that he'd reached the point of no return. Every choice led to violence now. The only question was who would be the target. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he'd hoped never to use. The number belonged to a man named Charles Elliott, a former military contractor who specialized in problems that required permanent solutions. Elliott's services were expensive, but Lane was long past worrying about money he didn't have. "I need to discuss a business opportunity," Lane said when Elliott answered. "What kind of business?" "The kind that requires absolute discretion and guaranteed results." There was a pause while Elliott considered the implications. "Local work? Very local. And very urgent. My fee for urgent local work is $200,000. Half up front, half on completion." Lane closed his eyes. He didn't have $200,000, but he could get it by liquidating the last of his client's accounts. It would be the final theft in a 3-year crime spree. But if everything went according to plan, there would be no one left alive to testify against him. "When can we meet?" "Tonight. The usual place." As Lane hung up, he felt something that might have been relief. The constant fear, the elaborate lies, the desperate scrambling to stay one step ahead of disaster, all of it would end soon. Either Bruce Sanders would die and Lane could disappear with whatever money remained, or Sanders would kill him and the nightmare would be over. He didn't know that Bruce Sanders was, at that very moment, sitting in Sam Erickson's car outside the warehouse, listening to every word through the surveillance equipment Sam had planted during their first visit. The phone call Lane had just made would be the last mistake he ever made as a free man. But it would also be the first step in a chain of events that would test just how far Bruce Sanders was willing to go to protect his daughter. Chapter 8: The Reckoning. The divorce settlement hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning, but by 8:30, the courthouse was buzzing with activity that had nothing to do with family law. FBI agents in dark suits were setting up surveillance equipment in an unmarked van across the street, while local police cordoned off the area around Dean Snyder's office building. Bruce Sanders stood at the window of his hotel room, watching the controlled chaos unfold below. He'd moved out of his apartment the night before, following Sam's advice that staying in predictable locations was no longer safe. The recording of Theodore Lane's conversation with Charles Elliott had been turned over to law enforcement, triggering a coordinated response that would have impressed Bruce if he hadn't been so focused on what came next. "They'll arrest Elliott when he shows up for the meeting tonight," Sam said, adjusting his tie in the hotel room's mirror. "Lane will be taken into custody on federal charges this afternoon. Snyder's probably already negotiating a plea deal. And Emma goes home with her mother, just like always. Except now her mother understands exactly what kind of man she was planning to let adopt her daughter." The irony wasn't lost on Bruce. After months of losing in the court system, justice was finally being served, just not in the courtroom he'd expected. But even with Theodore Lane facing federal charges and Charles Elliott under surveillance, Bruce couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. What if Lane doesn't wait for Elliott? What if he decides to handle this himself? Sam's expression grew serious. "That's why we're not going to the courthouse this morning. Let the lawyers handle the legal stuff. We're going to handle the security." They drove to Claudia's house through streets that felt strangely normal despite everything that had happened. Children walked to school, commuters hurried to catch buses, and life continued with the oblivious momentum of a world that had no idea how close it had come to tragedy. Bruce felt disconnected from the everyday normalcy, like a soldier returning from a war that no one else knew had been fought. Claudia's house, the house Bruce had built with his own hands, sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees and American dreams. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the driveway was recently sealed, and everything looked exactly the way suburban life was supposed to look. It was only when Bruce noticed the black sedan parked across the street that he realized Theodore Lane had already made his decision. "That's not one of ours," Sam said, following Bruce's gaze. "How can you tell?" "Because our guys are better at surveillance than that. Whoever's in that car wants to be seen." They parked 3 blocks away and approached the house from the back, using the alley that ran behind the subdivision. Bruce knew the neighborhood intimately. He'd built half the houses in it, and he knew exactly how to move through it without being detected. What he found when they reached Claudia's backyard made his blood run cold. The kitchen window was open, and through it Bruce could see his ex-wife sitting at the breakfast table with a man he didn't recognize. The man was holding a gun, and he was talking in the calm, professional tone of someone who killed people for a living. Emma was nowhere to be seen. "Charles Elliott," Sam whispered. "Son of a bitch moved up his timeline." "Where's Emma?" "Probably upstairs. Elliott's too smart to keep hostages in the same room." Sam was already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling this in." "How long for backup to get here?" 20 minutes minimum, maybe longer." Bruce stared at the house he'd built, at the woman he'd once loved, and at the man who was threatening everything that mattered to him. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Emma was somewhere in that house, probably terrified, definitely in danger, and every second they waited increased the chance that Theodore Lane's final desperate gamble would succeed. "I'm going in." "Bruce, no. This is what SWAT teams are for. SWAT teams are for situations where you can afford to wait." Bruce was already moving toward the house. "That's my daughter in there." Sam grabbed his arm. "And that's a professional killer holding a gun on your ex-wife. You go charging in there, and they're both dead. So what do you suggest?" Sam was quiet for a moment, his mind working through options that all ended badly. Finally, he pulled a small pistol from his jacket and handed it to Bruce. "You know how to use this? I grew up in Detroit. Of course I know how to use it." "Good, because we're going to split up. I'll go through the front, create a distraction. You go through the back. When things get loud, you get Emma and get out. Don't try to be a hero. Don't try to save Claudia. Just get your daughter to safety." Bruce checked the gun's magazine, chambered around, and looked at his oldest friend. "If this goes bad, it's not going to go bad. I didn't survive 15 years in the intelligence community just to get killed in suburban Michigan." They synchronized their watches and moved into position. Bruce crept through the backyard toward the kitchen door, while Sam circled around to the front of the house. Through the window, Bruce could see that Charles Elliott had moved Claudia into the living room, positioning her where he could watch both the front door and the stairs leading to the second floor. At exactly 9:15, Sam rang the doorbell. The effect was immediate. Elliott spun toward the front door, his gun tracking to cover the new threat. Claudia took the opportunity to bolt toward the stairs, screaming Emma's name. Elliott fired once, the bullet splintering the banister 6 inches from Claudia's head, then turned back toward the front door as Sam kicked it in. Bruce came through the kitchen like a man possessed, his entire world narrowed to the single objective of reaching his daughter. He heard gunshots from the living room, heard Sam shouting, heard Claudia screaming, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the small voice calling "Daddy" from somewhere upstairs. He found Emma huddled in her bedroom closet, tears streaming down her face, but otherwise unharmed. She threw herself into his arms with the desperate relief of a child who'd been sure she would never see her father again. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his neck. "I told him you'd come, but he said you were too scared. Nobody's ever going to hurt you again," Bruce promised, carrying her toward the window that led to the roof of the garage. "Daddy's going to make sure of that." The gunfire downstairs had stopped, replaced by the sound of sirens growing closer. Bruce helped Emma onto the garage roof, then followed her down to the backyard just as police cars flooded the street. Sam emerged from the front door a moment later, his arm bleeding, but his expression satisfied. "Elliott," Bruce asked. "Won't be threatening anyone ever again," Sam replied. "And Lane's in custody. Got picked up trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands." As paramedics checked Emma for injuries and police officers took statements, Bruce felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness. There had been too much violence for happiness, but the deep, exhausted peace of a man who'd fought for everything that mattered and won. Dean Snyder would lose his law license and face criminal charges. Theodore Lane would spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Charles Elliott would be buried in an unmarked grave after the coroner finished his investigation. And Emma would go home with her father, where she'd always belonged. The war was over. Bruce Sanders had won. Chapter 9, The New Foundation. 6 months later, Bruce Sanders stood in the backyard of his new house, watching Emma play on the swing set he'd built for her the week after the custody hearing. The house was smaller than the one he'd built for Claudia, but it felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years. Emma had her own room, decorated with posters of her favorite pop stars and shelves full of books she was finally old enough to read by herself. The legal aftermath had taken months to sort out. Theodore Lane had pleaded guilty to 18 counts of securities fraud and conspiracy to commit murder, receiving a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. The money he'd stolen had been mostly recovered, though several of his victims would never fully recoup their losses. Dean Snyder had been disbarred and sentenced to 3 years in prison for his role in the conspiracy. His law firm had been dissolved, his assets seized, and his reputation destroyed so thoroughly that even his former colleagues avoided mentioning his name. Claudia had moved back to her hometown in Ohio, taking a job as an elementary school teacher and trying to rebuild a life that didn't include the wreckage of her relationship with Theodore Lane. She called Emma every Sunday, and Emma dutifully reported on her week, but there was a distance in their conversations that might never completely heal. "Daddy, can we have hot dog for dinner?" Emma called from a swing set. "Sure, sweetheart, but only if you promise to eat some vegetables, too. Carrots. Carrots work." Bruce smiled as he headed back into the house. The simple negotiations of single parenthood had turned out to be far easier than the complex warfare of divorce court. Emma thrived on routine, on knowing exactly where she stood, and on having a father who was present for all the small moments that build a childhood. Sanders' construction had not only survived the crisis, but actually grown stronger. Word had gotten out about Bruce's fight for his daughter, and several large contractors had quietly started sending work his way. His reputation as a man who didn't back down from a fight had proved to be excellent for business. Sam Erickson had stayed in town, opening a private security firm that specialized in protecting people who couldn't find help through traditional channels. His first major client had been a woman whose ex-husband was using their children as weapons in a custody battle that the court system seemed powerless to resolve. Sam had resolved the situation in 3 days, and his phone hadn't stopped ringing since. "You know what I learned through all this?" Bruce said when Sam stopped by for dinner that evening. "What's that?" "Sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to. It just doesn't always work in the courtroom." Sam raised his beer in a toast. To justice served outside the law. To justice served wherever it needs to be served. They clinked bottles as Emma ran into the kitchen, her face flushed from playing outside. She hugged Bruce around the waist, then looked up at Sam with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something. "Uncle Sam, are the bad men really gone forever?" "They're gone, kiddo. Your dad made sure of that." "Good." She turned back to Bruce. "Daddy, can we call Grandpa? I want to tell him about the tree house we're building." As Emma chattered on the phone with Bruce's father, Sam leaned back in his chair and studied his old friend. The man who'd been broken and desperate 6 months earlier had been rebuilt into something stronger, something harder, but also something more complete. "Any regrets?" Sam asked quietly. Bruce considered the question as he watched his daughter's animated conversation. 6 months ago, he'd been a man who followed rules, who believed the system would eventually provide justice for those who deserved it. Now he was a man who understood that sometimes good people had to be willing to do questionable things to protect what mattered most. "None," he said finally. "Not a single one." Outside, the sun was setting over the suburban street where Bruce Sanders had built his new life. It was quieter than his old neighborhood, filled with working families and children who played in yards that stayed green because their fathers were home to water the grass. Emma hung up the phone and climbed into Bruce's lap, settling against his chest with the casual comfort of a child who'd never doubted her place in the world. Tomorrow there would be work to do, bills to pay, and all the ordinary challenges of being a single father. But tonight there was just this: the weight of his daughter in his arms, the sound of her breathing as she fell asleep, and the knowledge that he'd fought for everything that mattered and won. The foundation of Bruce Sanders' life had been shattered, but what he'd built in its place was stronger than anything that had come before. It was built on truth instead of lies, on love instead of convenience, and on the unshakable understanding that some things were worth any price to protect. Theodore Lane had made one phone call that changed everything. Bruce Sanders had made dozens of calls that changed everything back. And in the end, justice had been served exactly where it needed to be served: at home, where father and daughter could finally build the life they deserved. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation of Lies. Gabriel Callahan stood in the shadows of his own study, watching the rain streak down the tall windows of his Beacon Hill mansion. At 52, he possessed the kind of presence that commanded boardrooms and intimidated rivals. 6 feet 3 inches of disciplined muscle, steel gray eyes that missed nothing, and hands that had built a construction empire from nothing. Those same hands now held a crystal tumbler of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the lamplight like liquid gold. The house felt different tonight. Empty. It had been 3 months since the divorce was finalized, 3 months since Bridget had walked away with half of everything he'd built. But Gabriel Callahan was not a man who accepted defeat. He was a predator who planned his hunts with the patience of a spider. Gabriel's story began in the tenements of South Boston, where his Irish immigrant father, Seamus Callahan, had worked construction until his lungs gave out from decades of dust and cement. Gabriel had watched his father die, poor and forgotten, promising himself he'd never suffer the same fate. By 30, he owned Callahan Construction. By 40, he was worth $50 million. By 50, he controlled half the commercial development in New England. The doorbell's chime echoed through the marble foyer. Gabriel set down his glass and walked to answer it, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the hardwood. On the doorstep stood his son, Randolph. Randy to everyone except his father. At 28, Randy had inherited his mother's delicate features and his father's calculating mind, though Gabriel had recently discovered his son lacked his moral compass. "Evening, Dad." Randy stepped inside, shaking rain from his expensive coat. "We need to talk." Gabriel studied his son's face. Randy's green eyes, Bridget's eyes, held secrets. Over the past year, Gabriel had noticed the subtle changes. The expensive watch Randy couldn't afford on his marketing salary, the nervous habits when family gathered, the way he looked at his phone when he thought no one was watching. "Drink," Gabriel offered, leading Randy to the study. "Just coffee." Randy settled into the leather chair across from Gabriel's desk, the same chair where Gabriel had built his empire through countless late-night strategy sessions. Gabriel poured coffee from the silver service, a wedding gift from Bridget's parents 29 years ago. The Caldwell family had never approved of their daughter marrying a rough-edged construction worker's son, despite Gabriel's growing success. They tolerated him for the grandchildren and the lifestyle he provided, but he'd always felt their condescension. "What's troubling you, son?" Randy wrapped his fingers around the delicate china cup. "It's about Mom." Gabriel's expression remained neutral, but his pulse quickened. "What about her?" "She's been different since the divorce." "Happier." Randy's voice carried an odd note, something between guilt and defiance. "She's seeing someone." "I assumed she would be." Gabriel sipped his bourbon. "Your mother was never one to be alone long." "It's Chuck Herrera." The name hit Gabriel like a physical blow, though he didn't let it show. Chuck Herrera, his former partner, the man who'd helped him secure the contract that had made them both wealthy. The man Gabriel had trusted with his business secrets, his friendship, and apparently, his wife. "How long?" Gabriel's voice remained level. Randy shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, I don't think." "How long, Randolph?" 2 years. The words tumbled out. "Maybe longer. I've known for about 8 months." Gabriel set down his glass with deliberate care. 2 years. During the final years of their marriage, when Bridget had grown distant and cold, claiming Gabriel worked too much, cared too little. When she'd pushed for the divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and emotional neglect. She played the part of the neglected wife perfectly while screwing his business partner behind his back. "You've known for 8 months." Gabriel's tone could have frozen fire. "And you said nothing." Randy's face flushed. "She's my mother. I couldn't. She's my wife. With my wife." Gabriel stood, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. "And Chuck Herrera was my partner. My friend. Dad, please understand." "I understand perfectly." Gabriel moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "You chose them over me. Your loyalty lies with the people who betrayed me rather than the man who gave you everything." Randy stood abruptly. "It's not that simple. You were never around. You buried yourself in work while your mother was spreading her legs for Chuck Herrera." Gabriel turned, his steel eyes boring into his son's. "Don't romanticize their betrayal, Randolph. Don't make me the villain in their love story." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, Randy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you going to do?" Gabriel smiled, and Randy felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't the warm smile he remembered from childhood. It was the smile Gabriel wore when he was about to destroy a competitor. "I'm going to remind them both who Gabriel Callahan really is." Chapter 2. The Architect of Ruin. 3 weeks after Randy's confession, Gabriel stood in the private dining room of the Union Club, Boston's most exclusive establishment. Across the mahogany table sat Martin Gorman, a lean man with predatory eyes who specialized in information that others preferred to keep buried. Gorman had been Gabriel's secret weapon for years, the man who dug up the dirt that gave Gabriel leverage in business deals. "What do you have for me, Martin?" Gorman slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "Everything you wanted on Chuck Herrera and more." The man's not as clean as he pretends to be. Gabriel opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. Financial records, photographs, witness statements, a roadmap to Chuck's vulnerabilities. His former partner had expensive tastes and expensive habits, including a gambling problem he'd hidden for years. How much does he owe? $700,000 to some very impatient people in Providence. Vincent Santos and his crew don't typically extend payment plans. Gorman sipped his wine. Herrera's been robbing Peter to pay Paul for months. Gabriel studied a photograph of Chuck entering a seedy gambling den in Rhode Island. His former partner looked haggard, desperate. "Perfect. And my wife." "Ex-wife," Gorman corrected gently. "Bridget's playing house in that condo you bought her in Back Bay. She thinks she's trading up, planning to marry Herrera once his divorce is final." Gabriel's laugh was cold. Chuck's divorce. His wife doesn't know about the gambling debts. Or about Bridget. She thinks they're working late at the office. Gorman pulled out another photograph. Chuck's wife, Ana Herrera, a beautiful Latina woman who worked as a pediatric nurse. Anna's a good woman. Doesn't deserve what's coming. Gabriel studied Anna's picture. In another life, he might have felt sympathy. But Gabriel Callahan had burned that part of himself the day he learned about Bridget and Chuck's betrayal. Now, there was only the mission, complete and total destruction of those who had wronged him. "I need you to arrange a meeting with Vincent Santos." Gorman raised an eyebrow. "That's dangerous territory, Gabriel. Santos isn't someone you want to owe favors to." "I won't owe him anything. I'm going to do him a service." Gabriel closed the envelope. Chuck Herrera is about to have a very bad week. 2 days later, Gabriel sat in the back room of a restaurant in Providence's Federal Hill, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the aroma of garlic and olive oil. Vincent Santos was a small man with dead eyes and hands that had never done honest work. He listened without interruption as Gabriel laid out his proposal. "So you want to buy Herrera's debt? $700,000, plus whatever interest you feel is appropriate." Gabriel placed a briefcase on the table. "Cash." Santos opened the briefcase, his eyes lighting up at the neat stacks of hundreds. "What's your play here, Callahan? You don't strike me as the debt collection type. Chuck Herrera destroyed my marriage and stole my business secrets. I want him to understand the consequences of betrayal." Santos smiled, a thin line that never reached his eyes. "I like a man who understands revenge. Herrera's yours. But if he can't pay you back, that becomes your problem." "Chuck Herrera will never pay me back," Gabriel said quietly. "That's the point." That evening, Gabriel returned to his Beacon Hill mansion and poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan 25. The pieces were falling into place. Chuck's gambling debts were now Gabriel's to collect, giving him leverage over his former partner. But financial pressure was only the beginning. Gabriel had bigger plans. He walked to his study safe and withdrew a second envelope, this one containing building permits, inspection reports, and contractor agreements. Chuck's construction company was currently working on 3 major projects, including a luxury hotel in downtown Boston. What Chuck didn't know was that Gabriel had quietly acquired controlling interests in all 3 projects through shell companies. Gabriel picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Mitch Thompson speaking." "Mitch, it's Gabriel. I need you to conduct surprise safety inspections on the Herrera projects tomorrow morning." Mitch was the city's chief building inspector, a man who owed his position to Gabriel's political connections. "Any particular concerns I should be looking for?" "I'm sure a thorough inspector like yourself will find numerous code violations, enough to shut down all 3 sites pending extensive remediation." "I understand. Anything else?" "Make sure the press is notified. Chuck Herrera's reputation for quality work should be reassessed." Gabriel hung up and smiled. By tomorrow evening, Chuck will be facing debt collectors, shut down construction sites, and a reputation in ruins. But that was still just the opening move. The real game was about to begin. Chapter 3. The Trap Takes Shape. Gabriel stood in the marble lobby of the Four Seasons, his charcoal suit impeccable, his manner calm. To any observer, he appeared to be a successful businessman meeting a client for lunch. In reality, he was a predator stalking his prey. Chuck Herrera entered the lobby 20 minutes late, his usually perfect appearance showing signs of strain. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man watching his world collapse. The building inspections had shut down his projects, the debt collectors were calling hourly, and his business was hemorrhaging money. Gabriel. Chuck approached warily, as if sensing a trap. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Of course, old friend. Gabriel's smile was warm, but his eyes remained cold. I heard you've been having some difficulties. Perhaps I can help. They moved to the hotel's elegant restaurant, where Gabriel had reserved a private table overlooking the public garden. Chuck ordered a double scotch before noon, a telling sign of his desperation. I know what you're thinking, Chuck began, his voice shaky. About Bridget and me. I know how it looks. How it looks. Gabriel cut his steak with surgical precision. Chuck, you've been sleeping with my wife for 2 years. There's no ambiguity about how it looks. Chuck's face reddened. It wasn't planned. It just happened. Bridget was lonely. You were always working. So you decided to comfort her. How noble. Gabriel took a sip of wine. Tell me, when did it start? Before or after you convinced me to bid on the Riverside project? The question hung in the air like a blade. Chuck's face went pale as he realized Gabriel knew about the Riverside development, the project where Chuck had used inside information from Gabriel's company to underbid and steal the contract. Gabriel, I can explain. No need. I've had months to piece it together. Gabriel leaned back in his chair. You seduced my wife, stole my business intelligence, and used our friendship to destroy me. Very thorough. Chuck reached for his scotch with trembling hands. What do you want? Right now? I want to make you an offer. Gabriel pulled an envelope from his jacket. I'm prepared to pay off your gambling debts and restart your construction projects. Chuck stared at the envelope as if it might contain a snake. What's the catch? No catch. Consider it severance pay for 20 years of partnership. Gabriel's smile was magnanimous. There is one small condition, which is, you're going to leave Boston. Tonight, you'll disappear from Bridget's life, from my son's life, from my city. In return, I'll clean up your messes and you get to start fresh somewhere else. Chuck's eyes narrowed. And if I refuse? Gabriel's expression didn't change, but something deadly flickered in his eyes. Then Vincent Santos and his friends will collect their debt in ways that don't involve money. Your wife Anna will learn about your gambling and your affair. The building department will discover structural defects in your previous projects that could result in criminal charges. And Bridget will realize that her knight in shining armor is actually a broke, cheating gambler who's about to be arrested. The color drained from Chuck's face. You son of a bitch. I'm the son of a bitch you decided to cross. Gabriel stood, dropping the envelope on the table. You have until midnight to decide. Choose wisely. Gabriel left Chuck sitting alone in the restaurant, staring at the envelope that represented both salvation and exile. But Gabriel's day was far from over. His next stop was Bridget's condo in Back Bay, where his ex-wife was about to receive some unexpected news. Bridget answered the door in a silk robe, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the afternoon hour. At 48, she maintained the practiced beauty of a woman who had never worked a day in her life, courtesy of Gabriel's money and her own vanity. Gabriel, what are you doing here? May I come in? We need to discuss our son's future. Bridget stepped aside reluctantly. The condo was decorated in the modern style she preferred, cold, sterile, expensive. Nothing like the warm home they'd once shared. What about Randy? Gabriel settled into an uncomfortable designer chair. He's been accepted to the MBA program at Stanford. Full scholarship. Bridget's face lit up. That's wonderful. I'll call him right away. There's a condition. Gabriel's voice stopped her mid-reach for her phone. He leaves for California next week. Next week? But that's impossible. Chuck and I are getting engaged next month, and Randy's going to... Chuck won't be here next month. Gabriel watched her face carefully. In fact, Chuck won't be here tomorrow. Bridget sank onto the white leather sofa, confusion and fear warring on her features. What are you talking about? Your boyfriend has some debts, Bridget. Very serious debts to very serious people. He's leaving Boston tonight to protect his health. You're lying. Gabriel pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. Chuck entering the gambling den in Rhode Island. $700,000 to the Providence mob. Did he mention that during your romantic evenings? Bridget stared at the phone, her perfect composure cracking. No, that's not possible. Chuck doesn't gamble. Chuck does many things you don't know about, including maintaining a wife and 2 children he conveniently forgot to mention. The truth hit Bridget like a physical blow. She believed Chuck was divorced, that she was his fresh start, his redemption. The realization that she'd been just another lie in a web of deception shattered something inside her. Why are you telling me this? Gabriel stood, straightening his tie. Because I want you to understand something very clearly. You chose to betray our marriage for a man who was betraying you. Your judgment is as poor as your character. Bridget's eyes filled with tears, but Gabriel felt no sympathy. What happens now? Now you learn to live with your choices. Our son is going to Stanford, far away from this mess you've created. You'll stay in Boston and think about what you've lost. Gabriel moved toward the door. Oh, and Bridget, the trust fund your parents set up for you? I've been managing those investments for 20 years. Amazing how poorly money can perform when the wrong person is handling it. Bridget's face went white as the implications sank in. Her family money, her safety net, her independence. All of it had been under Gabriel's control since their marriage. You can't do this. My lawyers. Your lawyers work for me now. As of this morning, I've retained every competent divorce attorney in Boston for various consulting projects. Professional courtesy prevents them from working against a current client. Gabriel paused at the door, looking back at the woman who had shared his bed and his life for nearly 3 decades. She looked small and broken on the expensive sofa, surrounded by the empty luxury he'd provided. Goodbye, Bridget. Enjoy your independence. Chapter 4. The Son's Choice. The call came at 2:17 a.m. Gabriel answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting it. Dad? It's Randy. Chuck's gone. Gabriel sat up in his leather chair, where he'd been waiting in his study, a glass of bourbon growing warm in his hand. What do you mean, gone? He left Mom a note. Said he had to disappear, that people were after him. She's hysterical. Randy's voice was shaky, confused. She called me crying, saying you did something to him. I simply presented Chuck with some facts about his situation. What he chose to do with that information was his decision. Gabriel's voice remained calm, controlled. Where are you now? At Mom's place. Dad, she's falling apart. She really loved him. Gabriel felt a flash of anger at his son's misplaced sympathy. She loved the lie he presented. The real Chuck Herrera was a gambling addict with a secret family and debts to organized crime. Your mother chose to believe a fantasy. Maybe, but there are no buts, Randolph. Your mother destroyed our family for a mirage. Gabriel stood, pacing to the window that overlooked his meticulously maintained garden. Speaking of choices, we need to discuss your future. Silence stretched across the phone line. Finally, Randy spoke, his voice careful. What do you mean? Stanford's MBA program. You've been accepted with a full scholarship. Classes start next month. Dad, I never applied to Stanford. Gabriel smiled in the darkness. I applied for you. Your undergraduate transcripts, my recommendation letters, and a substantial donation to their business school made you an attractive candidate. I can't just leave. I have a job here, responsibilities. Your responsibilities are to your future, not to cleaning up your mother's mistakes. Gabriel's tone hardened. You have a choice to make, son. You can stay in Boston, watch your mother's world collapse, and remain tied to her poor decisions. Or you can go to Stanford, get your MBA, and build something meaningful with your life. You're trying to get rid of me. I'm trying to save you. Gabriel moved to his desk, where a manila envelope sat waiting. You've been caught between your mother and me for too long. It's corrupted your judgment. What's that supposed to mean? Gabriel opened the envelope, revealing photographs and bank statements. It means I know about the money. Randolph, The $50,000 you've been funneling to your mother from the trust fund I established for you. Randy's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. How did you? I established that trust fund. I monitor every transaction. Gabriel's voice turned cold. You've been stealing from me to support your mother's lifestyle, all while pretending to be neutral in our divorce. It wasn't stealing. That money was mine. That money was for your education and your future. Instead, you used it to help your mother maintain the illusion that she could betray me without consequences. Gabriel sat back down, his movements deliberate and controlled. You chose her side, Randolph. Now you get to live with that choice. Dad, please. Stanford or nowhere. Those are your options. Gabriel's voice was final. You can go to California, earn your MBA, and prove you're capable of loyalty and good judgment. Or you can stay here and watch your mother's world burn. But if you stay, you're no longer my son. The line went quiet except for Randy's breathing. Gabriel could almost hear his son's mind working, weighing loyalty against opportunity, family against future. What happens to Mom if I leave? Your mother is a grown woman who made her choices. She'll survive or she won't. That's not your responsibility anymore. You're really going to destroy her completely, aren't you? Gabriel considered the question seriously. I'm going to ensure she faces the full consequences of her actions. If that destroys her, it's because she built her life on lies and betrayal. Another long pause. Then Randy's voice, smaller now, almost childlike. I was trying to protect her. I know, but she didn't deserve your protection. I did. Gabriel's voice softened slightly. You're my son, Randolph. You have my intelligence, my determination, my potential for greatness. Don't waste that defending someone who chose another man over your father. If I go to Stanford, what happens to us? If you go to Stanford and prove you can make smart choices, you'll inherit everything I've built. The company, the wealth, the power, all of it. But if you stay here, clinging to your mother's sinking ship, you get nothing. Gabriel heard footsteps through the phone, then Bridget's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. Randy was still at her condo, still caught in her web. I need time to think. You have until tomorrow night. The plane tickets are already purchased. Gabriel's tone became businesslike again. First class to San Francisco, then a car to Stanford. Your apartment is already arranged. Your tuition paid. All you have to do is get on the plane. And if I don't, then you're choosing her over me, just like she chose Chuck over our marriage. And I treat all betrayers the same way. Gabriel hung up without waiting for a response. He'd planted the seeds. Now Randy would have to choose whether to grow into the man Gabriel had raised him to be, or remain a boy tied to his mother's apron strings. The next evening, Gabriel received a text message with a single word. Okay. 24 hours later, Randolph Callahan was on a plane to California, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the weight of his father's expectations. Gabriel watched the departure information on his laptop, feeling both satisfaction and a strange emptiness. His son had chosen correctly, but Gabriel wondered if he'd lost him in the process. No matter. Randy would learn the value of loyalty in time. And if he didn't, Gabriel had other plans for his legacy. Chapter 5. The Birthday Trap. 6 months had passed since Chuck's disappearance and Randy's departure to Stanford. Gabriel had settled into a routine of controlled isolation, running his empire from his Beacon Hill mansion while the rest of Boston whispered about his divorce and his ex-wife's spectacular fall from grace. Bridget had become a cautionary tale, the society wife who'd lost everything for a man who turned out to be worthless. But Gabriel wasn't finished. The real masterpiece of his revenge was still to come. The invitation arrived on expensive cardstock, hand-delivered to Gabriel's office by a nervous courier. Elegant script announced a birthday celebration for Bridget Caldwell at the exclusive Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel. The date was 3 weeks away, Bridget's 49th birthday. Gabriel studied the invitation with interest. After 6 months of near poverty, by her standards, Bridget was somehow financing an expensive party. Her family money was gone, her alimony was modest, and she had no other income. So where was the money coming from? Gabriel picked up his phone and called Martin Gorman. I need you to find out who's paying for Bridget's birthday party. Already on it, Gorman replied. The party's being funded by someone called Caldwell Holdings, LLC. Shell company registered in Delaware. Gabriel frowned. The Caldwell name was Bridget's maiden name, but her family had disowned her after the divorce scandal. Who's behind the Shell company? Working on it. But I can tell you this, someone spent serious money on this party. They've rented the entire ballroom, hired a full orchestra, ordered enough champagne for 200 guests. 200 guests. Gabriel smiled coldly. Interesting. Give me the guest list. 3 days later, Gorman delivered a detailed breakdown of the party arrangements. The guest list read like a who's who of Boston society: judges, politicians, business leaders, and social climbers. All people Gabriel knew, many of whom owed him favors or feared his power. More interesting was what Gorman had discovered about Caldwell Holdings. The company had been established 6 months ago with significant startup capital from an offshore account. Someone with serious money was backing Bridget's attempt at a social comeback. Gabriel studied the financial records, tracing the money through shell companies and foreign banks. The trail was sophisticated, professional, the work of someone who understood high-level financial manipulation. Finally, after days of investigation, a name emerged: Elvira Blake. Gabriel leaned back in his chair, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Elvira Blake was a legendary Boston socialite, a woman who'd married and buried 3 wealthy husbands while accumulating enough money and secrets to own half the city. She was known for her charity work, her ruthless social climbing, and her hatred of Gabriel Callahan. The hatred stemmed from a business deal 5 years earlier. Elvira had tried to pressure Gabriel into donating prime waterfront property for one of her charity projects. When Gabriel refused, she'd attempted to have the property condemned through political pressure. Gabriel had responded by exposing her 3rd husband's tax evasion to the IRS, destroying her family's reputation and costing them millions in penalties. Now she was using Bridget as a weapon against him, funding his ex-wife's social resurrection as a way to humiliate Gabriel publicly. The birthday party wasn't about celebrating Bridget. It was about showing Boston society that Gabriel Callahan could be defeated. Gabriel picked up his phone and made several calls. Within hours, he'd confirmed his suspicions. Half the guest list had received subtle pressure to attend, reminded of favors they owed Elvira or threats she held over them. The party was designed to be a spectacular snub of Gabriel, a public declaration that his ex-wife had moved beyond him. Gabriel smiled. Elvira Blake had just made the mistake of her very long life. 2 weeks later, Gabriel stood in the study of his Beacon Hill mansion, adjusting his tuxedo in the antique mirror. Tonight was Bridget's birthday party, and Gabriel had some surprises planned. The first surprise was his attendance. He'd never RSVP'd, but his name was on every exclusive guest list in Boston, and no host would dare turn him away. The second surprise was the gift he'd prepared for his ex-wife. Not a traditional birthday present, but something far more meaningful: the truth. Gabriel's phone buzzed with a text from Randy. "Dad, please don't go tonight. Whatever you're planning, just let it go." Gabriel typed back, "Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Your mother is about to get her final education." He deleted Randy's reply without reading it. His son would understand someday. Men like Gabriel Callahan didn't forgive and forget. They ensured that betrayal carried consequences severe enough to discourage future treachery. Gabriel slipped on his platinum cufflinks and headed for the door. The real party was about to begin. Chapter 6: The Revelation. The Fairmont Copley Plaza's ballroom glittered like a scene from a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of guests dressed in their finest evening wear, while a full orchestra played classics from the terrace. Bridget held court at the center of it all, radiant in a silver gown that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Gabriel entered through the main doors, his presence immediately noticed by those near enough to recognize him. A ripple of whispers followed in his wake as he moved through the crowd, nodding politely to business associates and former friends. Many seemed surprised to see him. Others looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Gabriel Callahan," a voice purred behind him. "How unexpected." Gabriel turned to face Elvira Blake, resplendent in emerald green silk and enough diamonds to fund a small country. At 73, she remained formidable sharp-eyed, elegantly vicious, and utterly without conscience. Elvira, lovely party. Very generous of you to fund Bridget's little celebration. Elvira's smile was razor-thin. I don't know what you mean. Of course not. Caldwell Holdings is quite an inspired name for a shell company. Very subtle. Gabriel accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Though I'm curious about your motivation. Surely you don't care about my ex-wife's happiness. I care about justice. You destroyed that poor woman's life out of spite. Gabriel laughed, drawing more stares from nearby guests. Poor woman? Bridget chose to commit adultery with my business partner. She destroyed her own life through her choices. She made one mistake. She made many mistakes. The adultery was just the most obvious. Gabriel's eyes found Bridget across the room, surrounded by admirers. But tonight isn't about past mistakes. Tonight is about revealing current truths. Elvira's face tightened. What are you talking about? You'll see. Gabriel raised a champagne glass in a mock toast. Happy birthday, Bridget. As if summoned by his words, Bridget appeared at Gabriel's side, her face flushed with champagne and triumph. She looked beautiful, confident, and completely unaware of the trap closing around her. Gabriel, I didn't expect you to come. Her voice carried just a hint of slur. She'd been celebrating enthusiastically. I wouldn't miss your special day. 49 years old and still stunning. Gabriel's smile was warm, almost fond. You look radiant. Happiness suits you. Bridget preened under the compliment, her guard lowered by alcohol and the evening's success. Thank you. That's very kind. I have a gift for you. Bridget's eyes lit up with curiosity. You didn't need to. Oh, but I did. Gabriel reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. Something special for a special woman on her special day. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle of Boston's most infamous divorced couple interacting civilly. Elvira Blake watched with growing unease, sensing something wrong, but unable to identify the threat. Bridget opened the envelope with delicate fingers, her smile bright with anticipation. Inside were photographs, several black and white images that made her face drain of color. What are these? She whispered. Birthday memories, Gabriel said, loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear. Some of my favorite pictures of you from the past 6 months. Bridget stared at the photographs, her hands beginning to shake. The images showed her entering and leaving a small apartment in Cambridge, always accompanied by the same man, a tall, dark-haired figure in his 30s. Gabriel, please. Please what? Please don't share your happiness with your friends. Gabriel's voice carried clearly across the ballroom. Everyone should know about your new relationship. After all, that's what tonight is really celebrating, isn't it? The orchestra continued playing, but conversations around them had stopped. Guests leaned in, straining to hear what was happening. Elvira Blake stepped forward, her face pale. Gabriel, whatever game you're playing. No game. Just a revelation. Gabriel took another photograph from the envelope, this one clearer than the others. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Bridget's new boyfriend, Doug Daly. The name rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Doug Daly was notorious in Boston circles. A handsome con artist who specialized in seducing wealthy older women, draining their resources, and disappearing. He'd been arrested twice, but never convicted, always managing to flee before the authorities could build a solid case. No, Bridget breathed, staring at the photograph. Doug isn't. He's a legitimate businessman. He owns restaurants. He owns nothing. Gabriel's voice was gentle, almost sympathetic. Doug Daly is a professional gigolo who targets recently divorced women with money. You're his latest mark, Bridget. The apartment he's been taking you to, it's rented by the week. The restaurants he claims to own, they fired him for stealing from a till. Bridget's legs gave out, and she would have fallen if Gabriel hadn't caught her arm. The photographs scattered to the marble floor, evidence of her latest humiliation spread for all to see. But he loves me, she whispered, her voice breaking. He said he loved me. He loves your alimony payments and the money Elvira's been giving you for this party. Gabriel helped her to a nearby chair, his movements careful and almost tender. Haven't you wondered how a man in his 30s could afford expensive restaurants and designer clothes on a waiter's salary? The cruel mathematics of the situation were becoming clear to everyone present. Bridget had been funding her own deception, paying for Doug's lifestyle while believing herself beloved. "Where is he?" someone in the crowd called out. "Where's Doug tonight?" Gabriel checked his watch. "Probably at Logan Airport. His flight to Miami leaves in about 20 minutes. He cleaned out the party account this afternoon. Roughly $40,000 that was supposed to pay for tonight's catering and music." As if on cue, the orchestra stopped playing. The bandleader approached with an embarrassed expression, clearly seeking payment that would never come. Bridget looked around the ballroom with growing horror, finally understanding the full scope of her humiliation. The party she'd thought was her triumphant return to society was actually being held hostage. The guests who'd come to celebrate her birthday were witnessing her complete destruction. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gabriel announced to the silent ballroom, "I'm afraid the party is over. The funding has been discontinued." Elvira Blake pushed through the crowd, her face twisted with rage. "You orchestrated this. You set her up." "I did nothing but reveal the truth." Gabriel's voice was calm, reasonable. Doug Daly found Bridget on his own. Their relationship was real, within the parameters of what Doug calls real. "I simply documented it." "You're destroying her." "No," Gabriel said quietly, looking down at Bridget's broken form. "She destroyed herself. I'm just making sure everyone understands the consequences of betraying Gabriel Callahan." The ballroom began to empty as guests fled the increasingly uncomfortable scene. Within minutes, only Gabriel, Bridget, Elvira, and a few staff members remained in the echoing space. Bridget looked up at her ex-husband, tears streaming down her face. "Why? Haven't you punished me enough?" Gabriel knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle for the first time in months. "This isn't punishment, Bridget. This is education. You needed to learn that choices have consequences, that betrayal carries a price. Tonight was your final lesson." He stood and straightened his tuxedo, preparing to leave. But before he could take a step, the ballroom doors burst open and a figure stumbled in. Randy, still wearing his Stanford sweatshirt, his face flushed from running. "Dad, stop. This has to stop." Gabriel turned, surprised by his son's sudden appearance. "Randolph? What are you doing here?" "I flew back when I heard about the party. I knew you were planning something." Randy moved to his mother's side, kneeling where Gabriel had been moments before. "Mom, are you okay?" Bridget reached for her son with shaking hands. "Randy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Gabriel watched the reunion with mixed emotions. His son had chosen to return, to stand with his mother in her moment of greatest humiliation. It was either an act of admirable loyalty or terminal stupidity. "You need to leave her alone now," Randy said, standing to face his father. "You've made your point. You've won. Isn't that enough?" Gabriel studied his son's face, seeing determination and moral conviction that reminded him of his younger self. "You're choosing her again. I'm choosing what's right. What you're doing isn't justice, it's cruelty." The words hung in the air between them like a sword. Gabriel felt a moment of something he'd thought burned out of him. Doubt. Then his eyes found Elvira Blake, standing smugly behind Randy, and his resolve hardened. "You're still naive, son. Your mother made her choices. Now she lives with them." Gabriel walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty ballroom. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at the tableau. His broken ex-wife, his defiant son, and his scheming enemy all clustered together in the ruins of their grand plan. "Goodbye, Bridget. Enjoy the rest of your birthday." The doors closed behind him with finality, leaving the others in silence, broken only by Bridget's quiet sobs. Chapter 7. The Son's Defiance. Gabriel sat in his study at 3 a.m., staring at the dancing flames in his fireplace. The events at the Fairmont played through his mind like a movie he couldn't turn off. He'd achieved everything he'd planned. Bridget was publicly humiliated, Elvira Blake's scheme had backfired spectacularly, and Boston society understood that crossing Gabriel Callahan carried consequences. So why did he feel so empty? The doorbell's chime echoed through the mansion. Gabriel glanced at the security monitor and saw Randy standing on his doorstep, still wearing the Stanford sweatshirt, his face set with determination. Gabriel considered ignoring the bell, but curiosity won out. He opened the door to find his son holding a suitcase and wearing an expression Gabriel hadn't seen since Randy was 12 years old and had decided to stand up to a neighborhood bully. "We need to talk." Gabriel stepped aside, allowing Randy to enter. They moved to the study in silence, the weight of the evening's events hanging between them like a physical presence. "How's your mother?" "Sedated. Elvira took her to her house in Brookline." Randy set down his suitcase and faced his father. "She'll survive, but something broke in her tonight. Something that might not heal." Gabriel poured himself a bourbon, not offering one to his son. Bridget has always been fragile when reality intrudes on her fantasies. She's fragile because you spent 6 months systematically destroying everything she cared about. Randy's voice cracked with emotion. "Dad, what you did tonight, it wasn't justice. It was torture. It was education. Your mother needed to understand." "Understand what? That you're more powerful than she is? That betraying you carries consequences?" "She learned that months ago." Randy began pacing, his movements agitated. "Tonight was about your ego, not about justice." Gabriel studied his son's face, seeing passion and conviction that reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self. "You flew back from Stanford to lecture me about morality?" "I flew back because I realized something. You're becoming the kind of man you always taught me to despise." Randy stopped pacing, his green eyes blazing. "You used to tell me that true strength was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. What happened to that man?" "That man learned not to trust people who claimed to love him. So you decided to become someone no one could love." The question hit Gabriel like a physical blow. He set down his bourbon with careful precision, fighting the urge to strike back at his son with words designed to wound. "I became someone who couldn't be betrayed again. You became someone who betrays first." Randy pulled a chair closer to Gabriel's desk and sat down, leaning forward earnestly. "Dad, I know what Mom did was wrong. I know Chuck hurt you, and I know I should have told you about their affair sooner. But what you've done in response, it's not who you are. It's exactly who I am. It's who I've always been. You just never saw it before." Randy shook his head. "The man I grew up with built schools and hospitals. He gave anonymous donations to children's charities. He taught me that a man's character is measured by how he treats people who can't fight back." Gabriel's mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "Your childhood memories are selective. I destroyed dozens of competitors to build my empire. I ruined people who stood in my way. The charities and good works were just window dressing." "No." Randy's voice was firm. "The good works were real. The generosity was real. The man who read me bedtime stories and taught me to play chess and spent weekends building tree houses, that man was real too." Gabriel felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he'd thought buried under months of rage and planning. That man was weak. He trusted people who didn't deserve trust. That man was my father. This, Randy gestured at the study, at the evidence of Gabriel's elaborate revenge scattered across the desk. "This is what you've become, but it's not who you have to stay." Gabriel stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the first hints of dawn were touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and gold. "Your mother destroyed our family. She chose another man over the life we built together. Did you expect me to simply accept that? I expected you to be better than her." Randy's voice was quiet now, sad. "I expected you to show me how a real man handles betrayal, with dignity, with strength, but not with cruelty." Gabriel turned from the window, studying his son's face. "And what would you have done if you were married 29 years and discovered your wife was sleeping with your business partner? If you learned your own son had been helping fund their deception?" Randy flinched at the reminder of his financial betrayal. "I don't know, but I hope I'd have been strong enough not to become a monster." "Monster?" Gabriel tasted the word, finding it bitter. "Is that what you think I am? I think you're a man who's lost his way. I think grief and anger have made you forget who you used to be." Randy leaned forward, his voice urgent. "But it's not too late. You can still choose to be better." Gabriel moved back to his desk, picking up one of the photographs from Bridget's birthday party. In it, She was laughing at something Doug Daly had whispered in her ear, her face radiant with happiness that turned out to be built on lies. She looked so happy, Gabriel said quietly. Even after everything that happened between us, part of me was glad she'd found someone who made her smile. What changed your mind? I realized he was using her the same way Chuck used her. She has a talent for choosing men who see her as a means to an end. Gabriel set down the photograph. At least Chuck loved her in his way. Doug just saw her as a paycheck. Randy was quiet for a long moment. Then, so you saved her from him. I exposed him for what he was. In front of 200 people, in the most humiliating way possible. Gabriel's jaw tightened. She needed to learn. She needed protection, not humiliation. She needed someone who cared about her to help her see the truth gently, privately. Randy's voice grew stronger. She needed the man who loved her for 29 years to remember that love doesn't disappear just because someone betrays it. Gabriel stared at his son, seeing a maturity and wisdom that surprised him. You think I still love her? I think you love the woman she used to be. The woman she could be again if someone helped her instead of destroying her. Randy stood, moving toward his suitcase. But that's not why I'm here. Why are you here? Randy unzipped the suitcase and pulled out a manila envelope. Because Elvira Blake isn't finished with you. She hired Doug Daly to seduce Mom. Gabriel's head snapped up. What? Doug Daly wasn't working alone. Elvira hired him 6 months ago to find Mom, romance her, and drain whatever resources she had left. Randy pulled documents from the envelope. She wanted to make sure Mom stayed broken, stayed desperate, so she could use her as a weapon against you. Gabriel took the documents, scanning bank records and wire transfers that painted a clear picture. Elvira Blake had funded Doug Daly's entire operation, from his expensive clothes to his rented apartment to his false restaurant claims. She wanted Mom to be publicly humiliated tonight, Randy continued. She wanted you to be seen as the man who destroyed his ex-wife so completely that she fell for an obvious con artist. It was supposed to turn Boston society against you permanently. Gabriel felt rage building in his chest, but this time it wasn't directed at Bridget or even at Doug Daly. Elvira Blake had manipulated his ex-wife's loneliness and desperation, using her pain as a weapon in their private war. How did you find this out? Doug called Mom from the airport. He felt guilty about taking her money and wanted to confess before he disappeared. Randy's voice was bitter. He told her everything about Elvira's payments, about the plan to humiliate you through her. Mom recorded the call. Gabriel studied the documents more carefully, his mind already working through the implications. Elvira had overplayed her hand, leaving a trail of evidence that could destroy her. What do you want me to do with this information? Randy met his father's eyes steadily. I want you to decide who you really are. The man who destroys people for revenge, or the man who protects people from those who would use them. Gabriel set down the documents and looked at his son, really looked at him. Randy had inherited Gabriel's intelligence and determination, but he'd also inherited something better, a moral compass that pointed toward justice rather than vengeance. You're asking me to forgive your mother. I'm asking you to remember that she was a victim too. Elvira Blake has been pulling strings since before the divorce, making sure Mom stayed isolated and vulnerable. Randy's voice softened. She used Mom's guilt and loneliness against her, just like you used her mistakes against her. Gabriel was quiet for a long time, staring into the dying fire. Finally, he spoke without looking at his son. What would you have me do? Help her. Protect her from Elvira. Show me that the father I remember, the man who taught me about honor and justice, is still in there somewhere. Gabriel stood and moved to his safe, withdrawing another envelope. Your mother isn't the only victim of Elvira Blake's schemes. He handed Randy the envelope, which contained financial records and legal documents. Elvira has been systematically destroying the families of her enemies for decades. The charity work she's famous for? She uses it to launder money and hide assets from her victims. The political connections she's so proud of? She maintains them through blackmail and bribery. Randy scanned the documents, his eyes widening. This is enough to put her in prison for the rest of her life. Yes. The question is whether I use this information to destroy her the way she tried to destroy me, or whether I find a more elegant solution. Father and son looked at each other across the desk, and Gabriel saw his own reflection in Randy's eyes. Not the cold, vengeful man he'd become, but the man he'd once been. The man he could choose to be again. I have an idea, Gabriel said quietly, but I'll need your help. Randy smiled for the first time since entering the study. What do you need me to do? Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Gabriel stood in the marble lobby of Blake Tower, the downtown skyscraper that served as headquarters for Elvira Blake's charitable empire. The building was a monument to her vanity, 40 floors of gleaming steel and glass, with her name prominently displayed in gold letters above the entrance. Gabriel had owned bigger buildings, but none quite so ostentatious. Randy waited in the car outside, monitoring police scanners and news feeds. Gabriel's plan required precise timing and complete surprise. Elvira had to be caught off guard, with no opportunity to activate her network of political protectors or destroy incriminating evidence. The elevator whisked Gabriel to the 40th floor, where Elvira's personal office commanded a panoramic view of Boston Harbor. Her secretary, a nervous young man who clearly recognized Gabriel, stammered something about appointments and schedules before Gabriel simply walked past him into the inner sanctum. Elvira Blake sat behind a desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, reviewing documents that probably contained the financial details of her latest scheme. She looked up at Gabriel's entrance with surprise that quickly hardened into hostility. Gabriel Callahan, you have some nerve coming here after last night's performance. Gabriel settled into one of her expensive leather chairs without invitation. Last night was quite educational. I learned things about you that I should have discovered years ago. Such as, Gabriel pulled out his phone and played a recording. Doug Daly's voice filled the office, confessing his paid seduction of Bridget and detailing Elvira's instructions to keep her isolated and desperate. Elvira's face remained impassive, but Gabriel caught the slight tightening around her eyes. I have no idea what you're talking about. Of course not. Gabriel switched off the recording. You're far too sophisticated to leave obvious evidence lying around. Fortunately, Doug Daly wasn't quite as careful as you hoped. Gabriel produced a manila envelope and spread its contents across Elvira's pristine desk. Bank records, wire transfers, recorded conversations, and photographs painted a comprehensive picture of her manipulation scheme. Impressive, Elvira said after examining the evidence, but hardly criminal. I hired a man to provide companionship to a lonely woman. Whatever he chose to do beyond, that was his decision. True, but this. Gabriel placed another set of documents on the desk. This is considerably more serious. Elvira's composure cracked as she recognized the financial records from her various charitable organizations. Detailed spreadsheets showed money flowing from legitimate donations into offshore accounts, then back into personal investments and political bribes. Where did you get these? Martin Gorman is very thorough. It's amazing what people will reveal when they think they're talking to a federal investigator. Gabriel smiled coldly. Your accountant was particularly helpful once he realized the FBI was interested in his creative bookkeeping. Elvira stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, Boston spread beneath them like a map of their shared battlefield. What do you want? Justice. Which means what, exactly? Gabriel joined her at the window, hands clasped behind his back. You've spent 30 years stealing from charities, bribing politicians, and destroying families for your personal entertainment. The Blake Foundation exists to launder money and provide you with a respectable cover for your criminal activities. You can't prove that. I can prove enough to put you in federal prison for the rest of your very long life. Gabriel's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Tax evasion, wire fraud, racketeering, bribery of public officials, the list goes on. You've been so careful to cover your tracks that you documented everything. Elvira turned from the window, her legendary composure finally cracking. What do you want from me? I want you to disappear. Disappear? Gabriel moved back to the desk, gathering up the evidence. You're going to liquidate your assets, return the stolen charity money, and retire to whatever non-extradition country appeals to you. Tonight. That's impossible. I have responsibilities, commitments. You have 12 hours to transfer $73 million to legitimate charity accounts and book a flight to somewhere the FBI can't reach you. Gabriel's tone became harder. I hand this evidence to the federal prosecutor and watch you spend your golden years in an orange jumpsuit. Elvira sank into her chair, the weight of her situation finally registering. You're giving me an ultimatum. I'm giving you a choice. The same choice you gave my ex-wife when you decided to use her pain for your personal vendetta against me. Bridget chose to have an affair. She chose to betray you. Yes, she did. But you chose to exploit her guilt and loneliness, to manipulate her into a relationship designed to humiliate her. Gabriel's voice carried steel. You turned her into a weapon against me, caring nothing for the damage it did to her. Elvira looked up sharply. You care what happens to her. Gabriel considered the question seriously. I care about justice. What you did to Bridget was evil, not because she didn't deserve consequences for her actions, but because you used her suffering to serve your own purposes. And what you did to her last night was cruel, perhaps more cruel than necessary. Gabriel's admission surprised them both, but it was honest cruelty. You hurt her with lies and manipulation. I hurt her with truth. Elvira studied Gabriel's face, searching for weakness or sentiment she could exploit. What happens to Bridget now? Do you continue your campaign of destruction? That's not your concern anymore. Your concern is transferring those funds and booking a flight before the FBI decides you're worth arresting tonight instead of tomorrow. Gabriel moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Elvira? The accountant who's been so helpful? He's already in federal custody, along with 3 of your political contacts and the manager of your offshore accounts. You might want to hurry. Elvira's face went white as the full scope of Gabriel's operation became clear. While she'd been planning Bridget's humiliation, Gabriel had been systematically dismantling her entire criminal network. You son of a bitch. Gabriel smiled, the expression warm and genuinely pleased. I'm the son of an honest construction worker who taught me that there are consequences for stealing from people who can't fight back. Consider this his legacy. Gabriel left Elvira alone in her office, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes and the ruins of her empire. He had no doubt she'd choose exile over prison. She was too clever and too vain to accept public destruction. In the lobby, Gabriel's phone buzzed with a text from Randy. FBI just arrived at Blake Tower. Timing is perfect. Gabriel smiled as he walked toward the exit. Federal agents were entering the building as he left, moving with the purposeful efficiency of people executing arrest warrants. Elvira would discover that her window for escape had just closed. The choice Gabriel had offered was an illusion. She was going to face justice whether she chose exile or imprisonment. The real choice had been Gabriel's, whether to destroy Elvira quietly or publicly, whether to end this war with a whisper or a bang. He'd chosen the bang because people like Elvira Blake needed to understand that there were still consequences for evil in the world. As Gabriel reached his car, Randy looked up from his laptop with a grin. The news vans should arrive in about 10 minutes. By tonight, every charity in Boston will know what Elvira Blake really was. Gabriel settled into the driver's seat, feeling lighter than he had in months. Phase 1 complete. Ready for Phase 2. More than ready. Mom's going to be surprised. Gabriel started the engine, pulling away from Blake Tower as FBI agents flooded the building. Your mother has had enough surprises for one lifetime. What comes next should be considerably more pleasant. As they drove through downtown Boston, Gabriel reflected on the events of the past year. He'd set out to destroy the people who'd betrayed him, and he'd succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. But somewhere along the way, the mission had changed. Now he was fighting for something more important than revenge. He was fighting for redemption. Chapter 9. The Last Dance. 6 months after Elvira Blake's arrest made national headlines, Gabriel stood in the kitchen of a modest colonial house in Lexington, making coffee and listening to the morning news. The anchor was discussing Blake's sentencing, 15 years in federal prison for charity fraud, tax evasion, and racketeering. Gabriel felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice served. The house belonged to Bridget. Gabriel had purchased it quietly through a shell company, then had Randy arrange for her in a charity raffle she'd never entered. It was smaller than what she'd been accustomed to during their marriage, but it was in a good neighborhood and came with a trust fund that would cover expenses and provide dignity without extravagance. Bridget appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a simple blue dress and the kind of smile Gabriel hadn't seen in years. The past 6 months had been transformative for her. Therapy, community service, and honest work as a literacy volunteer had given her purpose beyond social climbing and self-pity. "You're here early," she said, accepting the coffee cup he offered. "Randy's flight arrives in 2 hours. I wanted to make sure everything was ready for his graduation celebration." Bridget's smile widened. "I still can't believe he's finishing his MBA a semester early. We raised an impressive young man." Gabriel studied his ex-wife's face, noting the changes that had nothing to do with physical appearance. The desperate hunger for status and validation was gone, replaced by something deeper and more genuine. She looked younger, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. "He gets his work ethic from you," Gabriel said diplomatically, "and his moral compass from you." Bridget moved to the window, looking out at the garden she'd been cultivating. "Gabriel, we need to talk about us." Gabriel set down his coffee cup, recognizing the serious tone. "What about us?" "I've been thinking about the last 2 years, about what I did, what you did, what we became." Bridget turned from the window, meeting his eyes directly. "I want to apologize." "Bridget, please, let me say this." She took a deep breath. "I destroyed our marriage. Not because you worked too much or because we grew apart, but because I was selfish and weak and I made terrible choices. Chuck was a mistake, but staying with him for 2 years, that was a betrayal of everything we built together." Gabriel remained silent, letting her speak. "What you did afterward, the revenge, the humiliation, the systematic destruction of my life, it was cruel and devastating." Bridget's voice remained steady, but it was also necessary. "I needed to understand the consequences of my actions. I needed to lose everything to realize what I'd thrown away. I went too far," Gabriel said quietly, "especially at your birthday party. You didn't deserve that level of public humiliation. Maybe I did. Maybe I needed everyone to see what I'd become so I could finally see it myself." Bridget moved closer, her expression earnest. "But here's what I want you to know. These past 6 months, living in this house you secretly bought for me, receiving kindness from the man I betrayed, it's taught me something important, which is that Gabriel Callahan is still the man I fell in love with. Underneath all that anger and need for revenge, you're still the person who reads to children at the hospital and builds playground for poor neighborhoods." Bridget's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "You could have destroyed me completely. Instead, you saved me from myself." Gabriel felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the knot of rage and hurt he'd carried for 2 years. "I'm not the same man you married, Bridget. What happened between us changed me. It changed both of us. The question is whether we can change for the better." Bridget reached out tentatively, touching his hand. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not asking for another chance at marriage. But I'm asking if we can find our way to friendship. For Randy's sake, and for our own." Gabriel looked down at her hand, covering his, remembering all the years they'd been happy together. The betrayal still hurt, probably always would, but the rage had burned itself out months ago. What remained was something more complex. Affection mixed with wariness, love tempered by hard-earned wisdom. "Friends," he said finally. "I think I can manage that." Bridget smiled through her tears. "Thank you." The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted the moment. Through the window, they could see Randy climbing out of a taxi, his graduation cap perched jauntily on his head and his MBA diploma case in hand. "Our son is home," Bridget said softly. Gabriel squeezed her hand gently, then released it. "Let's go welcome him back." They walked to the front door together, and Gabriel felt a strange sense of completion. He'd set out to destroy the people who'd betrayed him, and along the way, he'd discovered something more valuable than revenge, the possibility of redemption. Not just for Bridget and Randy, but for himself. Randy bounded up the front steps, his face glowing with accomplishment and happiness. "Mom, Dad, He pulled them both into an enthusiastic hug. I did it. Graduated summa cum laude, internship offer from Goldman Sachs, and I met someone special I want you both to meet. Someone special? Bridget asked with a mother's curiosity. Her name is Lauren Reed. She's brilliant, beautiful, and she actually likes spending time with me despite my questionable family drama. Randy grinned at his parents. I thought I'd bring her home for Thanksgiving, if that's okay with both of you. Gabriel and Bridget exchanged a look, former spouses who understood each other well enough to communicate without words. They were thinking the same thing. Their son had found happiness despite the chaos they'd put him through. We'd love to meet her, Gabriel said. The guest room will be ready, Bridget added. Randy studied their faces, noting the absence of tension he'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 years. Are you two okay? You seem different. Gabriel considered the question. Was he okay? Was this strange new equilibrium they'd found sustainable? He thought about Elvira Blake in federal prison, about Chuck Herrera living under an assumed name in Florida, about the empire he'd built and the family he'd nearly destroyed in his quest for revenge. We're learning to be okay, Gabriel said finally. It's a work in progress. Randy's smile was brilliant, the expression of a young man who'd watched his family tear itself apart and was now seeing it slowly heal. That's all anyone can ask for. As they walked into the house together, Gabriel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd started as a man betrayed, had become a force of destruction and revenge, and had somehow found his way to something resembling peace. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life he could live with. The afternoon passed in celebration. Randy sharing stories from Stanford, Bridget showing off her garden and her volunteer work, Gabriel quietly pleased to see his son grown into a man of character and conviction. As evening approached, Randy prepared to leave for his hotel, promising to return the next day for more family time. Dad, Randy said as Gabriel walked him to his car. Thank you. For what? For finding your way back to being the man who raised me. For giving Mom a chance to find her way back too. Randy's voice was serious, adult. I know it wasn't easy. I know you had every right to stay angry and bitter. But you chose something better. Gabriel watched his son drive away, then returned to the house where Bridget was cleaning up the remnants of their celebration. She looked up as he entered, her expression questioning. Randy's right, Gabriel said. I did choose something better. We both did. Bridget nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for explanation. They'd both learned the same hard lesson, that betrayal and revenge could destroy everything you cared about if you let them. But grace and forgiveness could rebuild what seemed irreparably broken. Gabriel Callahan had been many things in his 53 years, a construction worker's son, a business empire builder, a husband betrayed, an enemy feared. But tonight, for the first time in years, he was simply a man at peace with his choices. Outside, Boston glittered in the darkness, the city where he'd won and lost and won again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to decide who Gabriel Callahan would be. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of family restoration,